We will criticize those thinkings which are conservative, ossified, and which do not favor reform in China.
Last Tuesday in Beijing, Deng Xiaoping sat for his first one-on-one television interview with 60 Minutes.
In September 1986, China's paramount leader spoke with CBS News correspondent Mike Wallace.
I asked Deng Xiaoping whether China would ever go back to the days before his economic reforms.
So long as the people think the existing policy is correct, whoever wants to change it will be brought down.
Deng's reference to internal differences and the possibility of leaders being brought down proved prophetic. But the tensions that would produce the Tiananmen Square crisis 3 years later were at this point bubbling just below the surface. For most American reporters, it was change in China that was the story. Barry Landau was Mike Wallace's longtime producer at 60 Minutes.
To meet the man who supposedly was the architect of those changes, that was a very important moment.
Deng's 60 Minutes interview came exactly 10 years after the death of Chairman Mao. In that decade, the market-style reforms Deng had initiated had begun to transform the face of China. Michael Parks spent the first half of the 1980s in Beijing for the Los Angeles Times.
So I was writing economic stories about a mode of development that I had never seen before, and actually nobody had.
For many American reporters then, including Michael Weisskopf, who took over the Washington Post bureau in 1981, the exotic, colorful side of China continued to get equal billing with the reforms.
But there were also lifestyle stories that if they didn't really interest the editors as much, the reading public loved them. And China was a laboratory at the time for real unique stories. We were the first reporters to report the history of the Shaolin monastery, and we talked to a couple of Shaolin masters. I did a story on Chufu, which was the home of Confucius. They were all done for the first time, and so it was heady, fun stuff to do.
As the reforms took hold, it also became slightly easier for reporters to talk to usually inaccessible Chinese officials.
We were able to invite the deputy editor of the People's Daily. We had access to senior officials in Xinhua. We used the journalist-to-journalist mechanism. But then we kind of branched out to the Academy of Social Sciences, which was then newly licensed to talk to people.
John Burns had spent 4 years in China for the Toronto Globe and Mail in the early 1970s. In 1984, he returned as the New York Times correspondent. He met the foreign ministry official who, a decade before, had denounced his critical reporting about the excesses of the Mao years.
The official who with a shrill voice, who used to reprove me, invited me to have supper with him in a smoky inn in the middle of Peking. And I said to him, Mr. Ma Yuzhen was his name, I was always puzzled because you must have warned me 8, 9, 10 times, and it was a pretty frightening experience sometimes. And I told him, I was sitting there thinking there are 850 million of you and only one of me. But why did you never arrest me, put me in prison, or more simply throw me out? I'll never forget his answer. And again, it was a lesson for life for a foreign correspondent. He said the reason was that you were writing what we were thinking.
Yet the internal tensions, the divisions between reformists and hardliners, which Deng Xiaoping obliquely mentioned to Mike Wallace, were real. Deng's key lieutenants, Communist Party General Secretary Hu Yaobang, widely seen as the designated successor, and Premier Zhao Ziyang, with the support of many intellectuals, were pushing for more rapid change. Others in the leadership, especially some influential party elders, were uneasy about the pace and consequences of reform. It was left to Deng Xiaoping to play the role of power broker, balancing the rival factions in the party. Reporters devised all sorts of ways to measure the shifting political winds.
I kept a collection of pictures of Zhao Ziyang's ties. He started appearing every so often, and then it became majority of appearances, and then all the time wearing a suit and tie. Big signal.
But the reforms Zhao Ziyang, Hu Yaobang, and Deng Xiaoping were pushing still faced resistance.
The policy of the open door was not at all secure. Deng Xiaoping was having to manage his position with the Politburo. So he was trying to hold together a very shaky kind of coalition in the Politburo and the Central Committee, in consequence of which there was a lot that had not yet changed, including the system for the management of foreign media.
Reporters still had to get permission 10 days in advance to travel anywhere outside Beijing, and they were still forced to sit through endless brief introductions from local officials. Richard Hornik, who'd previously been based in Moscow, arrived in the mid-'80s for Time magazine.
You always know that they're going to show you the absolute best they've got. And so you need to reverse engineer backward from that to what the middle might be. It was not that hard to get interviews if you were asking, again, the questions that they wanted to talk about.
In one such briefing, the Washington Post's Michael Weisskopf stumbled on a story that would shock the world.
We started talking about births, which was also a statistic. And it was some crazy lopsided number of males born versus females born. It was like 3 to 1, or 4 to 1. And so I said, how is it that you had this odd statistic? He said, well, people in our village want very much to have boys, and they abort or they kill the children at birth if they're daughters. And they didn't realize that how horrifying this picture was. And I just stuck in my notebook thinking that this is a story that needs to be told. And every reporting trip I took after that, I would have these kinds of interviews, and the interviews became much more sophisticated over time. And I was able to sort of enlist many of these commune bosses in being collaborators, not realizing it.
Fearing expulsion, Weisskopf waited until his China tour ended, and in early 1985, the Washington Post published his 3-part series.
And I had a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotal information from doctors and from firsthand sources, doctors who were under orders to kill children, to stick forceps through their brains as they came out of a woman's uterus if it was unplanned. Horror stories of that nature. There was an extraordinary imbalance between the birth of males and females, and it can only be explained by extraordinary infanticide. The Chinese reaction was denial and how this was a horrible stain on their reputation, and they condemned the Washington Post and me in particular on the front page of People's Daily. But there was international reaction as well. The United Nations, which was then financing Chinese family planning, had a fairly large program in which the United States was a primary sponsor. I think it was about $50 million a year we gave. And this was in the middle of the Reagan administration, and he just cut it off.
Still, for many editors at U.S. news organizations, the good news about China continued to outweigh the bad. This often led to tension between reporters and their bosses. James Mann had arrived in 1984 for the Los Angeles Times.
Living in China, you saw how superficial the westernization was. So more and more visitors were coming, and they would stay at places like the Jianguo or the new Great Wall Hotel, and they would come out with these sort of whoopee perceptions.
Daniel Southerland, a veteran Asia hand who'd spent years covering the Vietnam War, replaced Michael Weisskopf as the Washington Post correspondent in 1985.
I was trying to guard against the idea that China's going capitalist because I was a bit skeptical.
Well, unfortunately, the appetite in the magazine was, the Chinese are drinking Coca-Cola and driving around Cadillacs, and isn't it wonderful? Time showed up with a group of 35 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, the Time News Tour, and we actually got an interview with Deng Xiaoping. Terrific, charismatic, funny, talked about going to see Marx. Pretty good at answering direct questions, engaged everybody. Really, you could see why he was, why he had succeeded.
Hornik's colleague at Time was Jaime FlorCruz, a Filipino who'd been in China since 1971.
Jimmy had the connections, and he could make things happen to a certain degree, but also he had the perspective. As someone who doesn't know China or didn't know China, I was relying on him to tell me when I was going off the rails and when I was making too much of something.
Through all those years, I've collected a lot of friends, former classmates. I think it gave me a little, an extra layer of entry into people's lives and thinking, especially when you hear of, the Jewish factor. You could tell right away that it's not quite right.
But Deng's charm created a big journalistic problem for Hornik and FlorCruz.
Perhaps because of Deng Xiaoping's charisma and his legendary figure, I think just bamboozled a lot of the editors who joined that interview, and especially the top editors. So soon after they went back to New York, they came with a query, a request. Tell us why we should choose Deng Xiaoping as the man of the year. So the burden was reversed. Instead of starting with reasons, the process was give us reasons so we can choose him as the man of the year.
No matter, at the end of 1985, Time, for the second time in 6 years, named Deng Xiaoping Man of the Year. Well before the Time cover story, Mike Wallace, the most famous reporter at 60 Minutes, America's most popular TV news program, had been trying to land an interview with Deng. The Chinese leader had never done a one-on-one TV interview.
We promised them the moon, and we said this is going to be sensational. The first time he's really spoken out, the West is going to hear him. It's going to be in his own words. We'll lead the season of 60 Minutes with it. Who knows, maybe it'll be an hour broadcast. We put all these things into the air out there. And then they came back again and they said, okay, well, we've decided, yes, it's a go-ahead.
Wallace had interviewed almost everybody. Egypt's Anwar Sadat, the Palestine Liberation Organization's Yasser Arafat, Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. But the Deng interview in September 1986 presented a special challenge.
Our big problem there with the interview was, how do you make Deng Xiaoping human? And because for any kind of television interview, as you know, he cannot come across as a theoretician. It's got to come across as an interview with a human being, particularly for a wide audience. So I've never seen Mike Wallace as leery, as scared in a way before an interview as before that one with Deng Xiaoping.
When Wallace arrived in Beijing, he met with John Sheahan, who had become the CBS China correspondent earlier in the year.
John Sheahan, CBS News, Beijing.
Mike Wallace and I had worked on previous interviews. When I lived in Egypt, for instance, I helped arrange his interview with Yasser Arafat, and I helped organize his interview with Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. Now, in both cases, these were separated by time, of course, but in both cases, Mike came, and before the interview, the day before or 2 days before, we would work together. He would ask me to suggest questions and give him explanations of why this question might be important.
Sheahan suggested questions on problems with the reform process, which was stalling as reformers and conservatives continued to battle in the leadership. on human rights and trade disputes, and on U.S.-China cooperation against the Soviet Union.
And he wrote down everything. And then I was present in a conversation between Mike and the Chinese authorities, including Deng Xiaoping's daughter. The Chinese were impressing upon him, now, Mr. Wallace, we want you to understand that this is a unique event in history, that Deng Xiaoping has never done an interview like this, even on Chinese television, and that the historic importance is the interview itself, implying, I guess, that you don't have to ask tough questions.
The interview was in the huge, one of the huge government halls in Beijing, and rather than a normal interview where it's ourselves and the film crew, two crews, in this case there were probably a couple of hundred Chinese officials watching as an audience in chairs grouped all behind us. And so that turned it into a totally different kind of interview. It was really a performance by Deng Xiaoping. Also, Chinese television was recording the whole thing. And that was going to be broadcast across China. So we started the interview going with a few questions, and Deng Xiaoping was very, very wooden. He was coming back with ideology, with doctrine, and we tried to get him to open up a bit.
I sat there and listened to Mike softball Deng Xiaoping and not ask a single hard question. And I could hardly believe my ears.
Mike Wallace at one point asked him about his son, how Deng Xiaoping felt about the Cultural Revolution. Whereas, you know, he had tremendously suffered during the Cultural Revolution, and his son had been thrown out of the window of the university and had been crippled for life as a result of that. Deng Xiaoping refused to talk about that. He said, that's not important. And he kept throwing us off. And then we got the signal, well, your time is up. And we thought, my God, the time is up. You know, we've traveled halfway across the world. We've got this interview with Deng Xiaoping, and there's nothing on it.
China's state-run media put out the full transcript.
The Chinese had a totally different view of it. They thought, of course, that it was a great interview. The great man was expressing himself.
But back at CBS headquarters in New York, Landau and Wallace were struggling.
And looked at it, and it was kind of boring. And then I cut it down to 6 minutes and showed that to Don Hewitt, and it's like he fell asleep halfway through, Don Hewitt being our executive producer.
Don Hewitt, first of all, said, this is absolute trash. There is not a shred of news in this. We're not going to broadcast it.
Finally, he agreed to a show which I think had about 4 minutes of actual interview in it, plus a number of scenes of China to illustrate what we were talking about.
Wallace tried to make it seem newsworthy.
Chairman Deng also told us something he has never stated publicly before, that if his government and party colleagues agree, he intends to retire from all leadership posts at the party Congress next year.
In my view, the whole thing was a disaster, simply because we had this historic moment with Deng Xiaoping and hadn't been able to transfer it into something that was really alive and human. I did, I don't know, maybe 100 or so interviews or more with Mike Wallace over the years, and this was probably the worst interview that we did.
The Chinese, to whom Wallace had promised massive primetime TV exposure, were furious. And for John Sheahan in the CBS Beijing bureau, the consequences were immediate and severe.
I was summoned to the press office of the Foreign Ministry. They sat me down and they brought in a higher-ranking person than I had ever met before. He was introduced and his rank was explained to me. And it was like he was reading a statement. Mr. Sheahan, addressing you as Bureau Chief of CBS Bureau in Beijing, and the Foreign Ministry and the entire government of China declare to you today a policy of absolute non-cooperation with you personally or with your company.
For the New York Times' John Burns, frustration over a more general lack of official cooperation, the kind that all journalists based in Beijing struggled with, led to a fateful decision.
I decided to break free and go and see China for myself, defying the travel restrictions.
Accompanied by an American academic and a young U.S.-educated Chinese friend, Burns set out to retrace the journey made by Edgar Snow, the first correspondent to interview Chairman Mao in the 1930s, on a motorcycle.
I chose a motorcycle because it was universally available across China, so you could get spare parts easily. And so I just traveled from northeast China to southwest China, and I learned a great deal. When we got out there into the Chinese hinterland and saw the power of entrepreneurship, of initiative, then you understood that the sleeping giant was stirring. As was also the instinct of speaking freely. So it was the most wonderful trip.
Burns had been quietly encouraged to make the trip by his contacts at the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
Mao Yuzhen, my former adversary during the Cultural Revolution, who, again, in another smoky inn, over a dinner, I said to him, this is what I want to do. He said, tell me where you're going to go. And we sketched it out on my notebook. And he even said to me, don't apply. If you apply, we'll have to turn you down. If you're stopped along the way, simply refer them to me, and I will tell them it's okay. He's a friend of China.
Eventually, in a remote part of southwest China, Burns was detained by local police.
As I had been counseled by the officials in Peking, I referred them to Peking, and within 2 or 3 days, a bit rather comfortable confinement, the party secretary of the county came to us and said that they had heard back from Peking, and all was well. I was a friend of China, and we are going to organize a banquet for you because you are the first foreigners ever to have visited our county in all of history.
After returning to Beijing, weeks went by. Then, as he and his family arrived at Beijing airport to leave on a vacation, Burns was suddenly arrested.
A man came in to me and presented me with a very formal document which informed me I was accused of espionage. It was very unpleasant. The penalty for spying in China is bullet to the head. And then I was taken off to prison, and there was, prison uniform and strip search. And the prison governor stood in front of me and said, first time I'd heard this phrase, it's rooted in Chinese history, you shall hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And then they took me to a cell block, and they had painted in fresh red characters on the wall opposite the cell door, the penalty for spying in China is death. Fortunately, I knew enough about China to know that this was a charade.
As the Burns case became a major news story, the editor of the New York Times raced to Beijing.
In China, the bizarre case of New York Times correspondent John Burns. He was finally allowed visitors today. This was the 5th day of his detention in a Peking security police cell. The Chinese say they suspect him of spying. The Times says that's ridiculous. No one knows when or if he'll be let go.
I think there was a misunderstanding. John is a newspaper person and just a newspaper person.
Meanwhile, Winston Lord, who had accompanied Henry Kissinger on his secret trip to China in 1971 and had been present at Richard Nixon's meetings with Chairman Mao in 1972, was now the U.S. ambassador in Beijing and was pushing vigorously to resolve the incident.
And worked very hard with the Chinese because, as you probably know from the system there, that once you're brought to trial, you're guilty. I mean, 99%. So you got to make sure you don't have a trial. And so I worked very hard explaining to them the impact of this and made it a very high priority.
In the end, however, it took a personal letter to Deng Xiaoping from Nixon himself, who hated the New York Times but liked John Burns.
As he told me later, leading an American business delegation in the Soviet Union, and he read about this in the International Herald Tribune, he had a certain fondness for me because I had written a story about him visiting China as the ex-president. In China, the events of Watergate were of absolutely no significance to the Chinese, and they greeted him with great honor. So he loved his trips to China. He liked what I'd written about that. By the time he reached Paris at Orly Airport, he was met by, in a transit at Orly, or Charles de Gaulle, I forget, by a diplomat from the US Embassy in Paris, who gave him the message that the New York Times would be very grateful if he would write a letter on my behalf. And he did, which was quickly delivered to the US ambassador in China, Winston Lord, addressed to Deng Xiaoping, saying words to the effect of, "This is a good guy. He is not employed by US or any other intelligence agency, I am assured," and basically let him go.
Burns was put on a plane to Hong Kong. For the rest of the press corps in Beijing, the message from his expulsion seemed clear.
This was not a simple case of John Burns goes to forbidden territory, to a Neibu area and is kicked out. That this was meant as a warning to other correspondents not to travel too much, not to get too close.
Only later did Burns learn the real reason for his detention.
The circumstance which we were not aware of that had led to my arrest had to do with a dispute between the intelligence agencies of the United States and China involving the defection to the United States in Hong Kong of a very senior Chinese state security official. The Chinese did what they always do with a defecting tennis player or whatever. Did. Whether they still do or not, I don't know. Demanded the defector back. The United States said no.
It turned out Burns, due to his prominence as a New York Times correspondent, had been seized by Chinese intelligence as a bargaining chip. The U.S. officials in Hong Kong were desperate to learn what the Chinese had asked him. When Burns said they hadn't asked about the Chinese defector, the Americans lost interest. But Burns was worried he'd been tarnished, and held a press conference in Hong Kong to proclaim he wasn't a spy. 2 years later, a senior Chinese official visiting the United Nations met with the editors of the New York Times and acknowledged that Burns was not guilty, that what the official called bad elements in the State Security Ministry were responsible, and said Burns was welcome to return to China. But by then, Burns was based in Canada, and the Times had replaced him with Edward Gargan, a Chinese-speaking correspondent who'd previously been covering Africa.
My sense of China was established fairly early when I arrived, and it took 4 hours to get the luggage off the plane. It was not an efficiently run country in those days.
Indeed, by the fall of 1986, the inefficiencies, dislocations, inequities, and especially the corruption produced by the process of change was fueling popular discontent. The mode of corruption causing the most anger was known as guandao, officials buying goods at low state-fixed prices and then selling them on the open market with huge profits. Dorinda Elliot arrived in Beijing for Newsweek in 1986.
Back then it was this thing called guandao, which was basically, it was kind of arbitraging prices. Like they had started relaxing prices and they'd sort of partially relax prices, but then if you were a smart Chinese entrepreneur, you could play, the cheap prices there and then sell at a higher rate, and people were getting screwed all over the place.
At the same time, you had this talk about corruption, differences between the cadres who were making money, or their relatives were making money more like it, the sons and daughters of the officials who were making out well.
To keep the lid on popular discontent, party hardliners mounted yet another campaign against bourgeois liberalization.
So they launched this anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign. So I decided to try to see what was happening, how this was being received in a village in China. And I don't remember what village I went to, but I went off into, way off into the boonies in the countryside. And as a journalist, this was firstly no easy thing. You had to go through the foreign affairs office of the, province, and then it got down to the town level, whatever. By the time I got to the village, I probably had 20, Chinese, officials, Communist Party officials following me. And I remember going into this farmer's house, and I'm trying to have a conversation with this farmer in Chinese, but in the meantime, you know, like 15 or 20 government officials come into this tiny little house with me, and the entire village is basically looking through the window into the house. The family of farmers are totally terrified, have no idea what's going on. So I turn to this woman and I say, so tell me, you know, what do you think about the bourgeois liberalization campaign and you know, what's going on? And she says, she looks absolutely terrified, doesn't know what to say, and she says, well, the reason that we're supposed to support bourgeois liberalization is because, and you could see the officials saying, no, 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 you're supposed to, you know, you're supposed to be opposing bourgeois liberalization. And, you know, I felt like, oh my God, what have I done to this poor farmer?
In December of 1986, student demonstrations broke out in Shanghai.
CBS News correspondent John Sheahan is there.
The demonstrations are the biggest public upheaval in China since the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s.
Flew down to Shanghai, students marching in the street, very jubilant kids with no sense of even the possibility of danger toward them in any respect, that they felt that they had command of the story, command of their lives, of their futures, and of where China should go. I mean, there was an absolute explosions of confidence that they were going to change China.
Many of the students had been inspired by Fang Li-zhi, an astrophysicist at a provincial university and an outspoken advocate of human rights and intellectual freedom.
We first knew about this phenomenon of Fang Li-zhi when he was down at the, what was it, the Hefei, yeah, the University of Science and Technology at Hefei. And we heard that he was having these kind of salons with the students, and the students were, you know, in love with him.
Kind of an amazingly courageous man. I mean, he was basically just telling you what he thought, and he thought they needed reform.
The demands for more freedom and democracy could produce exactly the opposite effect.
It did start with the students, but it wasn't too long before some of the workers, some of the union members were very sympathetic toward the students and were supporting them.
I remember at that time thinking, wow, I mean, how could they possibly have pulled it off? Or how, you know, how come the authorities didn't try to stop it? Because even then, the conventional wisdom was you can't do it. It was the genie inside the bottle, that you cannot engage in public protests.
The reason was the leadership was divided. Party chief Hu Yaobang, a supporter of greater openness, resisted pressure from Deng Xiaoping and other party elders to crack down on the students. On New Year's Eve, the demonstration spread to the capital, especially Beijing University, Beida.
A group of us rather bravely decided that we were going to have a New Year's party at Eve's party at someone's house. That was thrown into complete chaos because we had the protests were going on at Beida, so everybody got in their cars and were rushing out to Beida. I brought a bottle of champagne because I thought, you know, everybody's been working around the clock, it'd be fun. We all sat around after we'd done a lot of interviews, as the clock ticked toward midnight. We all went back to the car, sat on freezing ourselves to death, and had a little bit of champagne, and went back to work.
Soon after, the authorities struck back.
The party responded by kicking out of the party Fang Li-zhi, leading dissident, Liu Binyan, dissident journalist, and so on. And I heard this as a rumor. I called a friend who was working at the People's Daily compound, which included several other papers too. And I called her and I said, would you have time for tea later today? And she said, oh, I'm busy late in the afternoon. And I said, would you have time maybe for lunch? And she said, can't do it then. Dinner? And she said, you know, just ask what you want. Tell me what you want to know over the phone. You foreigners, you're always so paranoid. And so I told her I heard that Fang Li-zhi and Liu Binyan had just been kicked out of the party, and she said, I haven't heard that. And about, I don't know, half hour later, the phone rings, and she has called back and she said, what you heard is true, which was what I needed to report the story, as I did. And whenever next time I saw her, whether it was 2 weeks or a month later, she said, you know, you're right about the telephones. I was called in and admonished for talking to you.
The same week, Hu Yaobang was removed as Communist Party chief.
You could see demonstrations in '86. You could see people pushing the envelope. As a result, Hu Yaobang was sacked by Deng Xiaoping because he was party secretary, to take the blame for this.
Without any doubt, it marked a sort of moment in which the brakes were being applied very strenuously to any drift toward liberalization, political liberalization. It wasn't clear at all what the consequences were going to be for economic policy.
Later in the year, Hu would be replaced as party chief by Zhao Ziyang, also a reformer.
He was not only a reformist, I mean, he was the leader of the reformists. I mean, Deng may have set in overall terms the general course. Zhao Ziyang's the guy who did it. Zhao Ziyang is the guy who went out and did the reforms in the countryside.
Although Zhao was forced to share some authority with the conservative Li Peng, who was soon named prime minister, economic liberalization continued. Adi Ignatius, who was married to Newsweek's Dorinda Elliot, arrived for the Wall Street Journal in early 1987.
China had begun the first significant economic reforms. They were obviously leading to an opening up in the economy.
I was talking to as many people as I could, and one of them was an executive from IBM who kept talking about, you know, China being the growing market and how, geez, you know, if he didn't say exactly these words, but if everyone in China bought one IBM, and so on.
As Western investors began to pour in, social liberalization accelerated as well. In mid-1987, I opened the CNN bureau. There was this sense that things were opening up, that the state's control over people's lives was easing. So we did stories about the earliest discos. We did stories about foreign business people coming to China, about this growing curiosity about connecting with the outside world. It was a really hopeful time. The CNN camera woman was Cindy Strand.
One of the first stories we covered, it was the first ever makeup exhibition in China. And this was held in this exhibition center. And the young women, mostly still then in pigtails and a lot of the Mao suits, they broke down the doors to get in because they wanted a different kind of face. They wanted to experiment with makeup, and they wanted to look pretty, and they wanted to have what people in the West had.
Good evening from the Forbidden City in the heart of Beijing.
In October 1987, the Chinese allowed NBC News to anchor a week of live programming from Beijing. The theme was Changing China.
So things were changing, and I'd like to say that I could see the scope of the change. Nobody could have imagined what they were going to be able to do as quickly as they did it. No one could have imagined that.
The highlight of NBC's programming was an interview Brokaw was granted with Zhao Ziyang, about to be formally named Communist Party chief, and which aired on NBC's Sunday talk show, Meet the Press.
We will criticize those thinkings which are conservative, ossified, and which do not favor reform in China.
In that interview, he was talking about how we have to provide economic opportunity for the young people. It was not just the theology of Maoism.
China scholar and journalist Orville Schell and his Chinese wife had helped NBC arrange the Zhao interview.
He talked for an hour, totally unscripted. And not only did he talk for an hour, but he was drinking beer the whole time. He had a couple bottles of beer beside him.
When the camera would cut to me, they knew that, and he would have a drink, and then they would replace it. I think he drank 2 quarts of beer during the course of the interview. But he was very candid, and he was not pandering to the American audience. He was describing who they were and why they were.
It was, you know, this moment where you could see belief that maybe China was going to kind of join the world as we knew it, politically as well as economically.
Yet at almost the same time that NBC was broadcasting from China, violent protests against Chinese rule broke out in Tibet.
It was a significant challenge to Chinese rule in Tibet, and monks were protesting and rioting, and a lot of us got out there. And so we all decided we just violated a very clear rule that we weren't supposed to go to Tibet, not with official permission.
They tried to keep control of us, but we spread out very quickly throughout the city. We stayed, in those days there was only really one hotel, or certainly there was the hotel where they could eavesdrop on us, called the Holiday Inn. And we went out and interviewed monks and who were extremely unhappy, and monks were shot, and there were enormous protests by the Tibetans against Chinese occupation for several days.
One of those who did not go to Lhasa immediately was Adi Ignatius' wife, Dorinda Elliot.
I'm sitting in Beijing, I'm the Newsweek bureau chief, and we get word on a Tuesday that the monks in Tibet are protesting, and I guess that there's been a crackdown. And it's a Tuesday. And the reason this is important for me is because I work for a weekly magazine, and the weekly cycle is the end of the week is Saturday. Okay, so Tuesday is very much towards the beginning of the week. So I get in touch with my editors in New York and say, this is incredible, this is a big story, I've got to go. So they said, well, I don't know, it's early in the week, let's see how the story develops. And, we'll see.
One of those who did make it to Tibet that week was Raymond Burkhart, the political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing.
At the airport, there were no hotel buses. And so we had to just take, sort of a regular bus to get into town, which was a good break, because the regular bus came right into, didn't go directly to the airport. It first came into the center of the city, and that's where everything was happening. And so we actually saw, demonstrators throwing rocks at police, and we didn't see anybody. We didn't see any firing at that point, but definitely a lot of rocks being thrown.
The continued trouble finally piqued the interest of Dorinda Elliot's bosses at Newsweek.
They read about it in the New York Times, and they start saying to me, oh my God, Dinda, get yourself to Lhasa.
Meanwhile, as the protests there continued, the Chinese authorities ordered the American reporters in Lhasa to leave.
And the Chinese brought in the military, and then they decided to throw all of us out before we could see and report on what they were going to do to the Tibetans.
A very memorable occasion in which the press was all summoned to a meeting. We were able to witness them telling the press how wrong it was for them to be there because they hadn't followed the rules in terms of applying 10 days ahead of time, and they had some other arguments too. So I remember that, of course, it was a loud and contentious session. I remember speaking up on behalf of the press without accomplishing a thing, of course.
Meanwhile, Dorinda Elliot had made her way to Chengdu in Sichuan province, where she bumped into the Washington Post Dan Southerland, who was also trying to get to Lhasa.
I go to the China Travel Service office in Chengdu. It's a Thursday, and they at that point have just stopped. They have just declared martial law in Tibet, and they have stopped selling tickets to Lhasa. And I'm thinking, holy shit, I have to get myself to Lhasa. Since I'm on my way, I've got to get there. So I'm standing at the window, and I see these two kind of hippies literally right in front of me who have just gotten tickets to Lhasa just before they stopped selling them. And I said to them, I'll pay you 3 times what you just paid for these tickets if you'll give them to me. And I swear to God, they said to each other, well, I guess we could go to Greece instead. So they went off to Greece. I get these 2 tickets, which, mind you, do not have my name on them or Dan Sutherland's name on them, and they've declared martial law in Lhasa.
That night, the journalists being expelled from Lhasa were confined to the Holiday Inn.
When you're confined to a hotel, there's not much you can do except have a party. So I had a big party in the room that I was staying in, and Ray Burkhart came, and a guy who was in the consulate in Chengdu showed up. So there were a couple of U.S. Embassy people there. And the rest of us were the reporters. And you open the door, and all down the hall are scattered these Chinese plainclothes security guys.
People had a good time that night. There was a lot of drinking and revelry. And something happened with Eddie Gargan.
The security guys tried to come into the room where we were having this party. We were all eating. You know, in those days, there was yak and there was yak to eat. And that's what we ate. And so we had yak snacks and yak burgers and beer and whatever we could get our hands on at the Holiday Inn. And these security guys tried to break into the room. And we pushed them out. And that I was regarded as having instigated the unhappiness, the unpleasant moment. I was taken away by the security services and interrogated for a couple hours.
I was summoned by a high-ranking official of the Tibetan so-called autonomous region to a meeting in order to protest to me the behavior of my citizen, Mr. Gargan. And I took that on board and sort of gave nothing back in terms of any promises or anything.
The next morning, as the reporters waited at Lhasa Airport to leave, Dorinda Elliot and Dan Southerland got off the plane from Chengdu.
We arrive in Lhasa, and literally the journalists who have been expelled the night before are walking, they're getting on the same plane to leave. I mean, I could see the journalists across the tarmac, and somebody had said to Dan and me, if you do anything, don't go to the Holiday Inn. The Holiday Inn was the one hotel where all the journalists were staying, and do not go there because you will be expelled immediately. So Dan and I, we went, the two of us went to, found some hippies and went to a place called the Yak Hotel, where we stayed, and we shared a room that was, my memory is that it was like 2 or 3 stories on the 2nd or 3rd floor. And the room, my memory is that it had a hole in the floor, and that basically was the toilet.
Elliot spent one day in Lhasa interviewing dissident monks.
At this point, my head, I thought my head was going to explode because of altitude sickness. We've been on bicycles. It's our one day in Lhasa. But there was a flight out the next morning. And so the next morning, we were in Lhasa for one day, and we flew out to Chengdu the next morning, and I managed to get the story to these jerks in New York who had said to me, oh, we're just, this story doesn't look that interesting, but then said, get yourself to Lhasa.
Shortly before the protests in Lhasa broke out, NBC's Tom Brokaw had been allowed to visit Tibet to do a piece to be aired during the network's China Week.
I had taken into Tibet postcards of the Dalai Lama, and they had said that he has no standing here anymore, and I walked around counterclockwise. The pilgrims come clockwise. And I had a camera crew behind me, and I would just take out a postcard and hold it up, and they would fall to their knees, get very emotional and weep. Well, they caught on to that quickly, and we got thrown out.
Then Brokaw went to India to interview the Dalai Lama before returning to China for NBC's planned week of programming.
All hell broke loose. They said I've got it all wrong, I violated what the arrangement was, I wasn't playing by the rules. If you run that, even after I got back, I was called to the embassy in Washington, and I didn't have to write a paper or anything, but they wanted to, and the ambassador's wife took my wife aside and said, Tom, Mr. Brokaw, I got that all wrong. Mary said, have you been to Tibet, to the ambassador's wife? She said, never, I never have. Mary said, well, I was there with him. I don't think you got it wrong.
At that time, reporters for newspapers, magazines, and the networks had the ability, if they could get permission from the Chinese, to travel. But the wire services, the Associated Press and United Press International, faced different pressures. Kathy Wilhelm joined the AP Bureau in 1987.
AP itself made it difficult for you to get out because they wanted you to be constantly on top of everything. So there was a certain fear at leaving the Xinhua machine. So, oh my gosh, are we going to actually unstaff the office and all go out and commit news and leave the Xinhua wire unattended? And what if it comes up with the announcement that Deng Xiaoping has died? And he didn't actually die until February of '97. But the whole time I was there was this idea that, if we could have had somebody 24 hours in that office watching the Xinhua machine for news of Deng's death. So that made it hard to get out.
Scott Savitt was a young reporter for UPI.
I lived in the UPI office, so I was never, I'm not saying that my apartment was in the office, so I never left the office.
Terrell Jones, whose mother was Chinese, was based in the AP's Tokyo bureau, but spent much of his time in Beijing.
The AP was kind of a vacuum cleaner for the news of the day, you know, going through all the local papers, watching the evening newscasts all the time, and then writing up stories from these sources and from ministry declarations that were not things that others might do on their own. But our work definitely appeared in a lot of other people's eventual stories.
I had a couple of friends who worked for the wires, and fortunately I would keep in touch with them because they often were getting stuff that we couldn't get right away. They were sort of the frontline troops slogging it out.
In October of 1987, the Chinese Communist Party held its 13th Party Congress. For the first time, some of the proceedings were open to the foreign press. This was the first time they'd ever opened up a party congress to the international media. I'd been in China as a student on my first trip in 1973 when the 10th Party Congress was held, and no one even knew that it had taken place until they announced the results afterwards. But this time they had a press center, they gave press briefings, we were allowed in to see some of the opening ceremony, the closing ceremony, a lot of the key moments. So it became a kind of important symbol of China's move towards growing openness.
Our driver drove me down to the Great Hall of the People to pick up the copy of the text of the work report that Zhao Ziyang delivered. And then at the appointed moment, they released the text, the hard text, and we all grabbed them. And I ran out. This is really old-fashioned journalism, right? There's no cell phone, no uplink, right? I ran out, hopped in the car, he drives me back. I'm, reading and translating and everything and mentally composing. I run into the bureau, I start writing, bam, leads, first ads, all that stuff, and then we do the write-through and everything. And
after the political upheavals earlier in the year, Zhao Ziyang appeared to be setting a clear course for accelerated reform.
In Zhao's work report, he had called for political reforms to match the economic reforms. It was a huge boost to reform, and it came on the backdrop of the prior winter, them having put down, obviously not so violently, student protests and calls for reform. So it flipped people's perceptions of where China was going.
What I remember mostly about the 13th Party Congress, of course, was the famous press conference afterwards.
We waited inside this big part of the Great Hall of the People. Remarkably, Zhao Ziyang, the newly elected General Secretary, came out, followed by an interpreter and the other top officials. We had our tape recorders and all that, and he started to answer some questions.
It was one of those moments, those rare moments when you really see a Chinese leader relaxed. I'm not sure if there's another comparable moment with Westerners, with Western journalists.
A lot of us were struck by how different this felt. We knew a little bit about Zhao, and we knew about his reputation as a relative liberal, as an economic reformer. But here he was with this kind of ease in this international spotlight. It was hard not to think, based on these atmospherics, that maybe this was a new group that was in place to change China significantly.
I think '88 was the most open year that I ever was able to observe while I was there, which was really exciting because I did stories on art and music and things changing, and people talking about sex more than they ever were able to before. People trying out jobs, experiments going on, and some opening up in the media.
In 1988, John Pomfret, who 6 years before had been a student at Nanjing University, joined the Beijing bureau of the Associated Press.
1988 was an incredibly exciting time in China. So you had the first nude art exhibition at the Central Academy of Fine Arts. And there were these sort of series of bizarre events pretty much every week. Something would just happen. The Chinese would call them a shirt, just a thing that would happen. And so there was this palpable feeling that some type of change was going to happen very quickly.
They didn't want to do art in the traditional ways. They didn't want to do the giant mountains with the fog and the pagodas and the temples. They wanted to take, Salvador Dali and break it and do a funny, picture of Chairman Mao like Andy Warhol would have done. That West was coming in, and art and music, and it was just a whole different thing that was going on there.
An art exhibition that took place summed up everything that was happening in China, which was basically that people felt like they could do stuff they could never do before. So suddenly, the government somehow gave permission for these kind of wacky young artists to take over one of the primary art galleries in the capital and have this sort of insane display of new, provocative, politically challenging and weird performance art.
In this fevered atmosphere, Betty Bao Lord, wife of U.S. Ambassador Winston Lord and a successful novelist, became an important link between Americans and China's increasingly disaffected artists and intellectuals.
There was more discussion of reform and opening there in many ways, and we did a lot of that at our embassy, particularly my wife, who had great access as a writer to the cultural and academic and reform communities.
Betty Bao Lord was very helpful because she had this sort of salon where she was inviting writers and artists to come in, and through her I met a number of really top-notch intellectuals and artists.
She just knew the artists and the intellectuals, and they would have these events at the embassy, and she was a connector. She would go out of her way to try to introduce you, if she liked you. She'd go out of her way to try to introduce you to interesting Chinese intellectuals, and that was a pretty amazing thing for an ambassador's wife to do.
UPI's Scott Savitt had a special connection with the Lords.
My girlfriend, Dee Dee Huang, was Betty Lord's secretary. I played tennis with Ambassador Lord and Mrs. Lord pretty much every day. So those were my sources of information. We got treated like their children, so we just hung out in that residence. It was a salon. They would have everything from General Zhang Zhen to Minister of Culture Ying Rocheng, Cao Yu the playwright. I attended all of them, mostly like helping clean up in the kitchen.
In the summer of 1988, China Central Television aired a documentary called River Elegy. It was a provocative critique of China's traditional, conservative, inward-looking culture, a call for more openness and greater reform.
I do remember this phenomenon of this television series called River Elegy, called Heshang, which showed on CCTV, and suddenly everybody was talking about it. The intellectuals were talking about it, and what it was basically, it was this group of kind of cutting-edge, almost underground intellectuals led by a guy named Su Xiaokang, who basically studied Chinese culture and Chinese civilization and determined that it was all basically based on feudalism. Obviously, this was like dynamite. It was incredibly amazing that it was shown on Chinese television. So that was a sign of something. We journalists couldn't really figure out what that meant, like which faction or how did it appear on Chinese television.
River Elegy sparked enormous interest among Chinese intellectuals and heightened the tension between reformers and hardliners. And it did so at a time when discontent over the state of the economy was growing, triggered by moves to eliminate long-standing price controls, which set off panic buying and bank runs.
There was inflation and there was panic buying of some things, of some foodstuffs. I do remember that.
As the economy started to go sour, that was something you could report. I mean, you could go to stores, you could see the prices, you could talk to people who were shopping, and they were willing to talk to you in a straightforward way about how they felt about what was happening in the economy.
As social tension mounted, conservatives blamed Zhao Ziyang and the reformers. Although expelled from the Communist Party, astrophysicist Fang Lijie continued to speak out for reform and became a favorite of many foreign journalists. Ncholas Kristof and his Chinese-American wife Cheryl Wudun arrived to take over the New York Times bureau in late 1988.
We knew Fang Lijie. He was one of the first people we met. I liked him a lot, and so we wrote, we wrote about that extensively.
I adored Fang Lijie. Fang was truly independent. He came out of this tradition of physicists and astrophysicists who just saw the world with a certain clarity and felt empowered as individuals to kind of speak the truth. So I thought he was amazing, and he obviously helped inspire students at various universities, including Beijing University, to kind of test the limits.
As 1988 drew to a close, Dorinda Elliot and Adi Ignatius organized a big Christmas party.
We lived in this foreign compound where Chinese who came to visit, they had to pass through guards. It was, for a lot of Chinese, a pretty scary experience, and the guards, you know, often would take their names and ask who they were. And we were just astounded that all these Chinese friends and contacts came, including, and the most exciting, of course, was that Fang Lizhi and his wife, Li Shuqian, came. It was this amazing scene where we had a piano, and somebody sat down at the piano and started playing Christmas carols.
We had avant-garde artists, we had the dissident astrophysicist Fang Lizhi, you know, all singing Christmas carols.
The whole crowd started singing Christmas carols, including these Chinese and Westerners and everything. It sort of touched upon this moment in China where everything was possible and everything was doable and everything was optimistic.
Deng Xiaoping has repeatedly tried to persuade President Reagan to pressure Taiwan toward reunification with China.
I believe that the United States, President Reagan in particular, can accomplish something with regard to this question.
What can they do?
They can encourage and persuade Taiwan to have 3 exchanges with us, namely the exchange of mails, trade, and air and shipping services. Contacts of this kind can help improve mutual understanding between the 2 sides of the Taiwan Straits, and this would create conditions for them to proceed to the discussion of the question of reunification and ways to achieve it.